Welcome once more to the Tyrant-Den. We got part 4 of the Crimean War, an extra history thing I don't super duper care about. I'm gonna be honest with you. It's neat the kind of location they're in, but very little sticks in my memory from episode to episode because I really prefer to binge extra history. But you guys seem to really be into this, so let's see how this goes and how much I can remember. Looks like from the thumbnail for this one, they're going to be fighting some sort of giant skeleton monster. Very excited for that.
Isle of Wight, England, December 2nd, 1854. The poet Alfred Lord Tennyson sets pen to paper. For weeks, he's read accounts of the Battle of Balak.
Okay, so we got Alfred Lord Tennyson, and we got the that Russian guy who wrote all the books your English teacher takes way too seriously.
And the brave yet wasteful cavalry charge that has captured England's imagination. He writes, half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, charge for the guns, he said, into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the light brigade, was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldier knew someone had blundered. There's not to make reply, there's not to reason why, there's but to do and die into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to the left of them, cannon in front of them, volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode and well, into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Yet that's not quite how it happened.
Ooh, how did it actually happen? They actually just stage a formal protest?
Thanks so much to Factor for showing us exactly how to make a great dinner happen fast. October 25th, 1854. Battle of Balaclava. The 500 men of the 93rd Highland Regiment draw themselves up in a line, 2 ranks deep, to repel the Russian cavalry charge. Now, usually, infantry would repel
I have still never to this day gotten a good reason for those hats.
Cavalry charge by forming a square, but their commander, Sir Colin Campbell, believes his troops are too green to accomplish that technical maneuver. This simpler one will maximize their firepower, and they have to hold. That morning, a Russian army of 25,000 had attacked the 6 forts forming the outer defensive line of the Allied position around Balaclava.
You know, there's got to be a bunch of troops who went there and misheard their commanding officer and really thought they were just going to get some delicious baklava.
Now, 4 of those forts are in Russian hands, and the enemy is in danger of cutting off the Allied supply port at Balaclava from the forces.
Okay, I'm remembering now, because the last one, they had like a really easy win condition right in front of them, but the commanding officers were like, no, we have to do that. We can't just take the easy win condition. We have to do this right, even if that means losing and humiliation. I mean, I don't think they actually said that. They just got in their head they had to do it a certain way and wouldn't listen to their NCOs.
Besieging Sevastopol, 10 miles inland. Campbell and his Highlanders, plus 350 Ottomans on their flanks, are the final defensive line in front of the port. He even called up walking wounded in a desperate attempt to repel the 400 Russian horsemen coming right at them. "There's no retreat from here, men," yells Campbell. "You will die where you stand." On a bluff overlooking
that's what I like to hear.
War correspondent William Russell sees what seems a tiny force opposing the oncoming cavalry. Later, he will describe it as a thin red streak tipped with steel.
No, you tell me you're going to die where I stand, I'll be like, at the last minute, I'll be like, you know what, actually, I'm good to go. If any of you are left alive, you can kill me at a firing range. But apparently there's not going to be, so bye!
The British fire once at 800 yards, a second time at 500,
yeah,
and they're about to fire again right in the faces of the Russians when the cavalry formation breaks up and wheels away. Russell will immortalize them in his reporting, with the group coming to be known as the Thin Red Line. Some of the most lauded allies.
I guess I'm dying at a firing line. Serves me right, really.
The war. Though historians do still debate if the Russian cavalry were just probing and never intended to charge, but it's actually another unit who would get the crowning glory of Russell's coverage, the Light Brigade. Now, the charge of the Light Brigade was a strategically minor event in the wider Crimean War. It neither won nor lost the battle.
But somebody wrote a poem about it. I'm sure there's a whole bunch of people who have done whole essay things about how that classic "We Hold the Line" speech from Mass Effect is all based on this, which might as well be true.
battle, but it did have an enormous psychic impact. And while the memory of the event and how it was memorialized in print is really what's important here, Rob did also really want to devote a whole episode to giving a blow-by-blow of what actually occurred, so we're gonna do that in a one-off following this series in about 2 weeks. Right, Zoe? Well, there you go. However, what you need to know right now is that the charge was
I don't have enough money for Nebula.
never meant to happen. Lord Raglan, looking at the battlefield from an elevated position,
I'd love to. I'd probably enjoy Nebula way more than I would YouTube these days. So like, it's just, it might cost money and it's a big life adjustment. So, but really, you guys should be on Nebula. Oh, watching Nebula, not over here.
ordered the cavalry to charge the heights in front of them to capture a
I'm really not selling my YouTube channel very well.
group of guns they could not see. However, he wrote a vague order, handed it to a messenger who explained it poorly, and who managed to offend the cavalry commanders badly enough that they didn't even question what seemed like a nonsensical order. Even to the war correspondent, Russell, with no experience, looking on from an elevated position, it was clear that something had gone wrong. He watched as the 600 men of the Light Brigade dashed across the field, at first assuming that they would turn and attack the guns on the heights or something. But instead, they tore straight down the valley toward a battery of Russian guns over a mile away, exposing themselves to fire not only from the front, but from the artillery on the heights on either side. Russell described it with a mix of awe and dread. The onrushing formation, the fire carving chunks out of their ranks, the way each man's sword flashed like a halo of steel, but the bravery seemed to make the blunder even worse. And when they returned, a full 40% of the Light Brigade had been killed, wounded, captured, or gone missing in 20 minutes of combat.
Oh, and incidentally, I should explain. When I make the sign of the cross when people die, it's not because I'm Catholic, it's because I really liked the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Now, to everyone watching and the public at home in Britain, the charge created mixed emotions.
This really feels like one of those things where, like, you're playing this in, like, a video game or something, and you made obviously a terrible call because you were either still learning the rules or you weren't really paying attention, and then you get out of it and you're sitting there like, wow, I wonder how they would possibly explain that in-world.
On one hand, Russell's dispatches on the action spurred admiration for the British soldiers, but on the other, it caused contempt for the incompetent aristocrats who had ordered and carried out the charge.
Is a new title really necessary?
Sir, after bestowing the gift of renting ease to millions, a bump is in order.
Okay, let's see.
Master of the rental sphere.
Wow.
The French commanding general Pierre Bosquet summed it up. When watching the action, he declared, "It is magnificent, but it is not war. It is madness." The Russians thought so too. In fact, they came to fear the British cavalry, who they considered lunatics. Russell's dispatches in the Times of London,
Brave
as
men
well
die
as
due to incompetent
correspondence reporting
leaders.
from
Military hospitals, terrible.
hospitals, had quickly taken the gloss off the conflict. Now, there was no anti-war movement as such, but the public was increasingly furious.
Hospitals bad. Brave men die due to incompetent leaders. No, they just combined those two headlines. Very efficient. Sorry, cramp.
About the camp squalor and epidemics their brave soldiers had to endure. News that wounded soldiers were going without treatment for weeks spurred major public debates, and military blunders, like the charge of the Light Brigade, widened the class divide between the newspaper-reading middle class and the aristocracy, which had a lock on the upper ranks of the military. Of course, it wasn't all down to Russell and the journalists. Ordinary soldiers were making their mark too. They wrote home about the poor
Good point. There probably weren't any NCOs to tell them they were being dumb in the first place. Just non-commissions who aren't allowed to talk to them.
conditions, the lack of medical care, and their dislike for their Ottoman allies. Indeed, while
Well, that's just a
transiting through
shame.
Constantinople, many officers found themselves upset that they were fighting to uphold a government that they considered backward and tyrannical. The Ottomans, for their part, were not loving their alliance either. As their government expected, the French and British treated them as the junior partner to be pushed around, even in their own capital.
Even though they obviously had better clothes.
When the Allies moved into Constantinople, they took over buildings as headquarters, barracks, and hospitals without asking permission, and to stay in the war, the Ottoman government had to take out extortionary loans from the 2 powers that gave France and Britain enormous economic and political pull in the country. In 1870, the Ottoman Empire, which had been Even on the battlefield, Ottoman troops were disrespected. At Balaclava, Ottoman soldiers had held the heights for hours with minimal support from their allies, with French and British troops only showing up after they'd broken. But because the Ottomans were retreating while the other allies were advancing, the Europeans sneered at them as cowards. The Russians also were displeased with the progress of the war. Tsar Nicholas was increasingly under economic pressure due to the Allied navies blocking trade in the Baltic. Forced to import goods from Prussia at astronomically high prices, the Russian economy was beginning to suffer, and their medical situation was also just as dire as that in the British camp.
Russia is such... It's a fascinating area geographically because it is huge and full of resources, but at the same time, despite being huge, and, you know, at times frequently, one side of the coast to the other, I mean, it's just still effectively, utterly landlocked. Which is just fascinating. Seriously, you'd think there'd be a little more people on the far eastern coast over near around North Korea is, but you just never hear about that.
On the battlefield, it was also...
Seriously, you would forget that area is even Russia, but they weren't close to the North Koreans, and the Alaska Purchase didn't happen.
increasingly clear to Russian soldiers that they were outmatched, poorly equipped, their bureaucracy badly run, and official corruption hobbling their supply efforts. Morale was low. Much like on the British side, aristocratic officers often treated war like a hunting trip and disappeared to lush residences for long periods as the ranks suffered in the field. Then, on November 5th, 1854, Prince Menshikov...
I mean, Russia must have an eastern fleet, right? You keep hearing about all this stuff. Now I'm just fascinated by the whole far eastern portion of Russia, because I mean they're so freaking centralized on a nation that's like way too big to justify being centralized. But I mean, that's China too. I mean, goodness knows the United States has enormous problems because of our own lack of centralization, but at the same time, it does lend a lot to our economy that we aren't so grievously centralized. I mean, yeah. So much of our TV shows kind of convince everyone that everyone freaking lives in New York City, but it wouldn't be great if everyone actually did, like Shanghai, Tokyo, and Novgorod was destroyed. St. Petersburg? Moscow? Yeah, why did you shrink? Anyway, I don't know enough about Russia.
made his last attempt to break the supply line between Balaclava and the siege works around Sevastopol. 11 days after the Battle of Balaclava, a Russian army 40,000 strong slammed into the 16,000 Allied soldiers. It was known as the Battle of Inkerman.
I mean, we're all kind of voting for Russia at this point, right?
The fighting took place in heavy...
In this event, not what's actually happening in the real world. What's actually happening in the real world, we're mostly... I mean, America's not great. We have no idea. I have no idea if the Ukrainian government is actually decent people or how much we even agree with them. I have no freaking idea. I assume they're ever so... at least ever so vaguely more LGBT friendly, just because that's what Russia accuses them of as a bad thing.
Fog, making Central Command impossible. Colonels, majors, and captains led this fight, acting purely on initiative, leading it to be nicknamed the Soldiers' Battle. Russian units used ravines to come up on British trenches nearly unseen, and fighting was close, often with bayonets, and one battery of artillery changed hands multiple times. Vastly outnumbered, the Allies only held due to the superiority of British rifles against smoothbore Russian muskets and the intervention of a large French contingent. By the end of the day, 10,000 Russians lay dead, wounded, or captured on the field. So while Balaclava captured the public's romantic imagination, it was Inkerman that was the decisive victory. Menshikov would never again challenge the Allies in the field. Instead, it would now be down to a pure siege. The Siege of Sevastopol and another year of war we'll tell you about next week.
I mean, that's fair, though. If you had such an obvious advantage and you still managed to lose, like in the Battle of Inkerman, yeah, that's kind of proof that you can't win. You can't beat these freaking dang Brits head to head. Okay, because it's just commercials now. All right. So that's the end of this number 4 thing, where I talk way too much about my not really knowing enough to satisfy myself with what's going on in the world right now, and he talked about this thing that happened back then. We got to see more incompetent British soldiers still winning, which is always just a bummer, isn't it? Oh, wrong one. Oh, yeah, I also do reactions to strong bad emails, if somehow you didn't know that.